Story 1. I poked at the embers, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. Amy sat close beside me, her head resting on my shoulder. Across from us, Mike and his girlfriend Sarah were laughing about something, their voices mingling with the sounds of the forest. "Man, I could get used to this," Mike said, leaning back against a log and stretching his arms. "No work, no phones, just the great outdoors." Amy smiled and nodded. "It's nice to get away from everything, isn't it, Jimmy?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, it's great." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest was too quiet, the night too still. I didn't want to ruin everyone's fun though, so I kept my mouth shut. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the crackling fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then, just as I was beginning to relax, a blinding white light erupted from the trees. It was so bright that I had to shield my eyes, and even then, it felt like it was burning into my retinas. "What the hell is that?" Mike shouted, jumping to his feet. "I don't know," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The light was accompanied by a strange metallic noise, like gears grinding together. It was loud, almost deafening, and it sent a chill down my spine. "We should check it out," Mike said, grabbing a flashlight. "Could be something cool." Amy gripped my arm. "Jimmy, no. Don't go." I didn't need much convincing. My heart was pounding, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to stay put. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, pulling Amy closer. Mike rolled his eyes. "Come on, Jimmy, don't be such a wuss. We'll just take a quick look." "I'm staying here," I said firmly. Mike shrugged. "Suit yourself." "Sarah, you coming?" Sarah hesitated, glancing at me and Amy, then back at Mike. "I guess so. It's probably nothing, right?" "Probably," Mike said, grinning. "Let's go." Amy and I watched as they disappeared into the trees, the beam of Mike's flashlight cutting through the darkness. The light and noise gradually faded, leaving us in eerie silence. "They'll be fine," I said, more to convince myself than Amy. "They'll come back, and we'll all have a good laugh about it." But the minutes dragged on, and the night grew colder. There was no sign of Mike or Sarah. Amy was trembling beside me, her grip on my arm painfully tight. "Jimmy," she whispered, "what if something happened to them?" I swallowed hard. "They're probably just messing with us, trying to scare us. You know how Mike is." "I don't like this," Amy said, her voice quavering. What if they don't come back?" "They'll come back," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Deep down, I knew something was wrong. We waited for hours, huddled together in the tent, but Mike and Sarah never returned. The night stretched on, filled with the sounds of the forest and the pounding of my heart. Finally, as dawn began to break, I couldn't take it anymore. "We need to go look for them," I said, standing up and grabbing the flashlight Mike had left behind. Amy's face was pale, but she nodded. "Okay. But let's stay together, okay?" "Of course," I said, taking her hand. "We'll just find them and get the hell out of here." The forest was eerily quiet as we walked, the early morning light filtering through the trees. Every shadow, every rustle in the underbrush set me on edge. I kept expecting Mike to jump out and yell, "Gotcha!" But the further we went, the more I realized that wasn't going to happen. Then we found the bones. At first, I thought they were from an animal. A deer, or maybe a bear. But as we got closer, I saw the truth. These weren't animal bones. They were human. A ribcage, half buried in the dirt, with scraps of flesh still clinging to it. Amy gasped and covered her mouth. "Oh my God, Jimmy." I backed away, bile rising in my throat. No, this can't be real. But it was real. And it got worse. A few feet away, I saw something else. Something that made my blood run cold. A clump of long blonde hair attached to a piece of scalp. Sarah's scalp. Amy screamed, and I grabbed her, trying to pull her away. But then I heard it. A low humming sound, like the vibration of metal. The same sound from the night before. It was coming from the trees ahead. "Amy, we need to run," I whispered, but it was too late. They stepped out of the shadows. Two figures, tall and thin, with gray skin and large black eyes. Aliens. There was no other word for them. They moved with an unnatural grace, gliding across the forest floor like they were weightless. One of them reached out, long fingers wrapping around Amy's arm. She screamed and tried to pull away, but its grip was like iron. I lunged at it, trying to pry its fingers off her, but the other one grabbed me and threw me to the ground with impossible strength. "Amy!" I shouted, scrambling to my feet. "Let her go." The alien didn't even look at me. It brought its mouth, if you could call it that, close to Amy's arm and bit down. She screamed again, louder this time, as blood poured from the wound. The thing was eating her, devouring her flesh like she was nothing more than meat. I froze, paralyzed with terror. I wanted to help her, to save her, but my body wouldn't move. All I could do was watch as the life drained from her eyes, as the light faded and she went limp in the alien's grasp. Then it turned to me. I don't remember screaming, but I must have. I don't remember running, but somehow I ended up back at the campsite, alone and trembling. The aliens were gone, and so was Amy. So was everyone.
Story 2. When I met Rick online, I thought I'd finally found someone special. At 40, I'd had my share of bad relationships, and honestly, I was tired of the whole dating scene. But Rick was different. He was charming, attentive, and had this air of mystery about him that I found irresistible. Our first date was magical. He took me to a cozy little restaurant where we talked for hours. He was funny, intelligent, and seemed genuinely interested in me. But there was something a little odd. He didn't eat anything. Not a bite. When I asked, he said he wasn't hungry, and I shrugged it off. Everyone has their quirks, right? The next few dates were much the same. We'd go out, have a great time, but he never ate or drank anything. And there were other things too. He never wanted to be intimate, always coming up with excuses. He was tired, had an early meeting, or some other reason. I tried not to let it bother me, but it was strange. One evening, after another date where Rick politely declined to eat, I couldn't help but ask, "Rick, why don't you ever eat or drink around me?" He smiled, that same charming smile that had won me over, and said, "I just have a very strict diet. I don't like to break it." "A diet that doesn't allow food?" I teased, trying to lighten the mood. He chuckled. "Something like that." But his eyes were distant, like he was hiding something. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. And then there was the matter of his clothes. He always wore the same style. Long sleeves, high collars, even when it was warm. And he never wanted to take his clothes off. Not even when we were alone in his apartment. "Rick, don't you ever relax?" I joked one night, trying to get him to loosen up. I reached for his collar, playful, but he stiffened, grabbing my hand firmly. "Diana, please," he said, his tone sharper than I'd ever heard before. I pulled back, surprised. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "It's fine," he interrupted, forcing a smile. I have some scars. I'm self-conscious about them. Scars? I asked, curious. From what? He hesitated. An accident. A long time ago. It's not something I like to talk about. That shut down the conversation, but it didn't stop the questions in my mind. The more time I spent with Rick, the more uneasy I felt. I needed to know what he was hiding. So one day, when Rick was at work, I made a decision that would change everything. I knew where he lived, but he had never invited me over. That was another red flag. Why was he so secretive about his place? My curiosity got the better of me, and I drove to his house, parking a few blocks away so he wouldn't see my car. His house was ordinary, almost boring in its plainness. It didn't match his personality at all. I walked up the driveway, my heart pounding, and found the spare key he'd told me about under the mat. I hesitated for a moment, feeling guilty, but I had to know. I let myself in and began to explore. The house was spotless, almost sterile, with nothing personal lying around. No photos, no knickknacks, nothing. It was like no one really lived there. I wandered from room to room, feeling more and more unsettled, until I reached a door at the end of the hall. It was locked, but I found the key on a hook nearby. When I opened the door, I found myself in a small, dimly lit room. It was mostly empty, except for a large wardrobe against one wall. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle. Something in me screamed not to open it, but I couldn't stop myself. Inside there were masks. Dozens of them, all hanging neatly on hooks. Masks of Rick's face. Each one identical, with that same charming smile, those same eyes that had captivated me. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. What the hell was this? I heard a door slam somewhere in the house. Panic surged through me. Rick was home. I had to hide. I slipped into the wardrobe, closing the door just enough to leave a crack to see through. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he'd hear it. Footsteps approached the room, slow and deliberate. Then Rick walked in. Only it wasn't Rick. Not really. He was dressed the same, but there was something off about him. His movements were jerky, unnatural. He walked to the center of the room and began to undress. I stifled a gasp as he removed his shirt. His skin wasn't skin at all. It was a slimy, brownish substance that glistened in the dim light. He continued to undress, revealing more of that disgusting, alien form. His body was thin, almost skeletal, with limbs that were too long, too spindly. Then he reached up to his face and pulled. The mask came off with a sickening squelch. What lay beneath was a nightmare. His real face was hideous. Amorphous, with large bulbous eyes and a mouth that stretched too wide, filled with sharp yellow teeth. The mask had been a perfect replica, but now I saw the truth. Rick wasn't human. He was some kind of creature, something that had been pretending to be a man. I was frozen in terror, unable to move, barely able to breathe. The creature. Rick tossed the mask onto the bed and started to pace, muttering to himself in a language I couldn't understand. Then he stopped and sniffed the air, his head snapping in my direction. I shrank back into the wardrobe, praying he wouldn't find me, but I knew it was only a matter of time. I had to get out, but how? My mind raced, searching for a way to escape. Rick, or whatever he was, began to move toward the wardrobe. I could see those horrible eyes scanning the room, searching for something. My heart pounded in my chest as he reached for the door. But just as his hand touched the handle, there was a noise from somewhere else in the house. A loud bang, like something falling. He paused, his head twitching toward the sound. After a tense moment, he turned and left the room, moving quickly down the hall. I didn't wait to see where he was going. I bolted from the wardrobe and ran for the front door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't care if he heard me. I just needed to get out. I flung open the door and sprinted to my car, hands trembling so badly I fumbled with the keys. The engine finally roared to life, and I sped away, not daring to look back. My heart pounded, my breath coming in ragged gasps. What had I just seen? What was Rick, or whatever that thing was? But as I turned the corner onto my street, my panic subsided just a little. I was almost home. I could lock myself in, call the police, and... The engine sputtered, then died. The car coasted to a stop, and I pounded the steering wheel in frustration. No, no, no. I glanced around. The street was empty, eerily silent. I was only a few blocks from my house, but the thought of walking the rest of the way in the dark sent a chill down my spine. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course. Just my luck. I took a deep breath. Okay, Diana. You just need to make it home. That's all. I stepped out of the car, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, convinced that thing was right behind me. But the street was still empty. Maybe I was safe after all. Maybe it hadn't followed me. I started walking, trying to stay calm, but every sound made me jump. A rustling in the bushes, a distant dog barking. It all made my heart race. I forced myself to focus on the warm light of my house just ahead, a beacon in the darkness. I was almost there. Just a little farther. Then I saw him. Standing in the middle of the road, just outside my front door. Rick. He was back in his human form, dressed in those same clothes, his face a perfect mask of charm and warmth. But I knew better now. Diana, he called out, his voice smooth and reassuring. You left so suddenly. I was worried about you. I froze, my blood turning to ice. How had he gotten here so fast? How did he even know where I lived? My mind raced with questions, but I knew the answers didn't matter. I couldn't go home. Not with him there. Stay away from me. I shouted, backing away. He took a step forward, his smile faltering. Diana, don't be afraid. I can explain everything. Explain? I laughed, the sound bitter and frantic. Explain how you're not even human. How you've been lying to me this whole time. How you're some kind of monster. He stopped, his eyes narrowing. You shouldn't have gone into my house, Diana. That was a mistake. I turned and ran. I didn't care where, just away from him, away from that nightmare. But I didn't get far. Before I could even scream, a cold hand clamped over my mouth, yanking me back into a dark alley. He was in front of me now, his mask slipping as his voice grew cold and mechanical. I really liked you, Diana. But now you know too much. I struggled, but his grip tightened. He leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear. You shouldn't have snooped. Now I have to start over, again. And then, with horrifying clarity, I realized the truth. I wasn't the first. There had been others. Women just like me who had fallen for the perfect man, only to discover too late what he really was. And now I was next.
Story 3. We arrived in Varginha under the cover of night, the humid air clinging to us as we stepped off the small charter plane. The city, nestled deep in the Brazilian countryside, was quiet. Too quiet. There was an unease in the air, a kind of tension that I hadn't felt since my days in the military. Agent Marjorie D. Gibbs, my partner, looked at me with a raised eyebrow as we made our way to the waiting SUV. "Does it feel off to you, Tim?" she asked, her voice low. I nodded. "More than a little. Something about this place, it's like the calm before a storm." The drive into the city was uneventful. The roads empty, except for a few stray dogs and the occasional late-night wanderer. The streets of Varginha were lined with modest houses, most of them dark, their inhabitants long since gone to bed. But even in the stillness, there was a sense of watchfulness, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Our first stop was the local police station. The officers were tight-lipped, clearly uncomfortable with our presence. They handed us a report filed by 3 local girls who claimed they had seen something. Something not of this world. In a vacant lot on the outskirts of town. "Do you really think we're dealing with an alien?" Gibbs asked as we skimmed the report. I shrugged. "That's what we're here to find out." The girls were waiting for us in a small interview room. They couldn't have been older than 17, and they looked terrified. Their hands trembled as they recounted their story. "We were walking home," said Liliana, the oldest of the 3. "It was just after lunch. We took a shortcut through the lot. And that's when you saw it?" Gibbs prompted. Liliana nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "It was crouched there behind some bushes. At first we thought it was a homeless man, but then it looked at us." Her friend Valeria shuddered. Its eyes, they were big, red and shiny. Like marbles. "What did it do?" I asked. "It just stared at us," Liliana continued. "Then it made this strange noise, like a moan or a whimper. We ran as fast as we could." The third girl, Katia, had remained silent until now. "It was hurt," she said quietly. "I think it was scared." Gibbs and I exchanged a glance. I could see the doubt in her eyes. This was the kind of story you'd expect from frightened teenagers, not something worthy of an FBI investigation. But we didn't have the luxury of disbelief. Not after everything we'd seen over the years. "Thank you, girls," I said, standing up. "We'll take it from here." The vacant lot wasn't far from the station. We drove in silence, the tension thickening as we approached. The lot was overgrown with weeds, a few scraggly trees dotting the landscape. It was an unremarkable place, the kind of spot you'd overlook unless you knew what to look for. Gibbs scanned the area with her flashlight. "Think we'll find anything?" "We're about to find out," I replied, my hand hovering near my holster. We searched the lot thoroughly, but there was no sign of anything unusual. Just as I was about to call it a bust, Gibbs spotted something near the edge of the trees. "Tim, over here." I walked over and saw it immediately. A patch of scorched earth about the size of a car, with strange marks burned into the ground. It looked like something had crashed here, something that didn't belong. "This is it," I muttered. "The crash site." Gibbs knelt down, brushing her fingers over the charred soil. "Whatever landed here, it was hot enough to burn the ground. But there's no debris, no wreckage." "Maybe it was retrieved," I suggested. "Or maybe it walked away." Gibbs looked up at me, her face pale in the moonlight. "Walked?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. We followed the trail into the forest, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The trees closed in around us, the underbrush thick and tangled. The further we went, the stronger the feeling of unease grew, like we were being watched. After about half an hour of searching, we found it. The alien was slumped against a tree, its body twisted at an unnatural angle. It was small, barely 4 feet tall with grayish skin that shimmered faintly in the dim light. Its eyes, large, red, and unblinking, stared straight ahead, filled with pain and fear. Gibbs gasped, taking a step back. "My God, it's real." I didn't respond. Instead, I pulled out my phone and sent a coded message. Within minutes, we heard the sound of approaching helicopters. The Brazilian military was efficient. Too efficient. They knew exactly where to go, and they arrived in full force, securing the area in record time. A team of scientists disembarked from one of the helicopters, their movements precise and rehearsed. They didn't speak to us, didn't even acknowledge our presence. They only had eyes for the alien. Are we just going to let them take it? Gibbs asked, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. "We have our orders," I said calmly, though inside I felt a pang of guilt. "But what happens now?" she pressed. "What do they plan to do with it?" I turned to her, my face expressionless. "That's classified." Before she could respond, a low, rumbling growl emanated from the alien. The scientists stopped, their instruments beeping wildly. The creature's eyes, once dull and lifeless, began to glow with an eerie red light. It stood up, its body convulsing, stretching, growing. In mere seconds, the harmless-looking alien had transformed into a monstrous figure over 4 meters tall, its limbs elongating, its skin rippling as spikes jutted out along its spine. "Tim, what the hell is that?" Gibbs whispered, backing away. "Run!" I shouted, drawing my gun, knowing it wouldn't do a damn thing. Chaos erupted as the alien-turned monster let out an ear-splitting roar. It moved with terrifying speed, slashing through the soldiers and scientists like they were nothing more than paper. Blood sprayed across the trees, the ground, the sky. I fired off a few rounds, but the bullets barely slowed it down. Gibbs was ahead of me, sprinting through the forest, her breath ragged. "Tim, come on." But I was too slow. The creature turned its gaze on me, its eyes burning with an otherworldly fury. It lunged, and I knew I was done for. The last thing I saw was its massive claw descending toward me, and then there was nothing but pain and darkness.